ancient organization called the Old Brewery Mission. It's not the only ancient organization founded in the social gospel back in the late 1800s, but it's been around a long time. Homelessness has been around a long time. And for basically 100 years, from the late 1800s until the late 1900s, it was a pretty stable issue. It was not a top 5, top 10 public health issues or issues of public concern. Over the course of the 80s and 90s, I think we all know what happened. There was this explosion of homelessness. Just we've heard of big pharma and big oil. Big homelessness started to appear in the early 2000s. And the reaction of the sector, of the homelessness sector, in seeing this massive increase in the number of people was to grow emergency services, growing shelters, growing transport services, growing day services to meet the immediate humanitarian need of homeless people. That's what we did. That's what we did for 100 years, so we just kept doing it. But there was this awareness that somewhat shocked the system to say, is that all we're going to do, is to be witnesses to distress and poverty? Is that all we're going to do? So the first great reorientation of the sector happened in the early 2000s. I was very proud to be at the Old Brewery Mission. It was my first tour of duty at the Old Brewery Mission, 2004 to 2008. I was the executive director at the Old Brewery, and with so many others, there was this realization that it was time to change and to start seeing emergency services as a pretext to work with homeless people to be able to get them out of homelessness, not as the end in and of itself. And so housing became the focus in so many different ways of the sector. So trying to get people out, changing our staff, changing our orientations, changing our relationships so that we could solve homelessness and not just manage it. You've heard that before. Let's move from managing to solving homelessness. That was the early 2000s. So it was a result of frustration. That's really what brought us to that point. And for 20 years, the focus has been exactly there. Housing homeless people, people who are already homeless. But over the last 20 years, with probably an early period of stability, what we've seen in the last 10 or so years has been a new increase. So we've seen homelessness go up again. COVID has been a huge contributor to it. We know that. The new street count will probably confirm a serious increase in the number of people, both living on the street, living in shelters, and living in other types of uninhabitable areas without an address of their own. So here we are. I put to you that we're in the same place to some degree now, 2023, that we were back in the early 2000s. And that it's time for a second reorientation, one to complement the first, where we focus not just on housing people who are homeless, but housing people who are at risk of homelessness. I think this is the time to actually start to think in serious ways about that. The Old Brewery Mission has seen just such a significant increase in the amount of emergency services that we've been having to offer. And so to see a quantitative increase, it's not just that though, it's a qualitative change. I think you probably all who are working in the sector directly probably have seen the same thing. Before COVID, we had 0 naloxone interventions, people having overdoses in the shelters. 0, we had no interventions whatsoever. 2 times a week, we have to intervene with naloxone to prevent serious damage resulting from overdose. We've seen the rise of homeless encampments. Donald Tremblay is in the room representing the campers living under the Ville-Marie Expressway. That didn't exist. The whole phénomène des campements did not exist as we understand it today 10 years ago. So we have a moral imperative, folks, to start to think about not only housing homeless people, but preventing the trauma that is related with homelessness as we see it today. To know better is to do better. And so thus, this Collectif pour la Prévention de l'Itinérance, the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative, that's a long name. It was probably too long. Suggestions for new English names, welcome. But this is a chance to think at a policy level about how to complement all of our efforts in housing homeless people to try to identify people at risk of homelessness and try to divert them, trying to prevent people who from becoming homeless in the first place, reducing demand. That is the purpose of this organization that we've created and the purpose of this conference. So welcome to the beginning, I hope, of a new orientation in the homelessness sector in Quebec. Okay. So what is the CQPI? Before I hand it over to Eric, I just want to tell you just a little bit about the Collectif itself. As Ari said off the top, it's a partnership. It's a partnership of the Old Brewery Mission and McGill, who we've been working with together forever. And this is an opportunity to join the expertise, obviously, of the community sector and the university sector to try to bring those joint, unified expertise to bear on this particular topic. We have a steering committee between the two organizations to try to steer this organization, and its objective is reform. Simple. We're looking at reform. This is not a service organization. It doesn't provide services. It's trying to think about the policies that may help us prevent homelessness. So that is the strata that we're working in, is the strata of policy and policy reform, okay? We have 5 working groups that we call the initial working groups. There's so much more we can do. But those 5 are really exciting, and and you'll hear a lot about them over the course of the next day. And these are sectors which are generating homelessness. So conjugal violence, immigration, youth, correctional services, and the mental health sector. Those are the initial 5. We've just created a new advisory committee as well called La Réforme Juridique. So actually starting to think about the kinds of political changes, legal changes that may be helpful in achieving this common objective. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Eric. Welcome again. We're really excited to have you here to join all of our brains and our cranial networks to try to think about the way forward. So bonne conférence tout le monde.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être ici aujourd'hui. Je veux commencer par une analogie. Récemment, l'économiste lauréate du prix Nobel en économie, Esther Duflo, était de passage à l'Université de Montréal pour recevoir un prix. Et elle faisait l'analogie entre le potentiel d'influer les changements climatiques par une multiplicité d'actions et les travaux auxquels elle a été fortement associée, ceux de faire de l'expérimentation pour découvrir les meilleures façons de venir en aide aux personnes les plus démunies, souvent dans des pays en voie de développement. Donc, on est passé d'une approche soit théorique, bon, il faut augmenter le PIB par habitant pour que les pauvres aillent mieux, à une approche beaucoup plus ciblée sur beaucoup d'actions au niveau des moustiquaires pour la malaria, de l'éducation, comment payer les enseignants dans les écoles en Inde, etc., etc. Il me semble que le problème de prévention de l'itinérance est assez analogue, dans le sens que si on se met à regarder comment les gens deviennent itinérants, on voit qu'il y a de multiples passages, de multiples façons que les gens empruntent pour entrer en situation d'itinérance. Par exemple, un des résultats qu'on a trouvé dans le dénombrement de 2018, c'était que, je crois que c'était à peu près 24% des personnes de 50 ans et plus qui étaient en situation d'itinérance étaient devenues itinérantes pour la première fois au cours de la dernière année. Donc on voit que ce n'est pas juste un phénomène qui frappe les jeunes, ça frappe aussi les personnes plus âgées. On sait aussi qu'il y a des mécanismes particuliers pour les jeunes qui sortent des centres de prévention, des centres jeunesse. Il y a des mécanismes spécifiques pour les femmes avec la violence conjugale, et ainsi de suite. Donc, il ne faut pas penser en termes de, comme on dit en anglais, a magic bullet. Il faut penser beaucoup plus en termes de beaucoup de mesures ciblées. Cela dit, il y a peut-être quand même un peu une différence, c'est que la même personne peut passer à différents moments par des institutions ou des endroits où on peut prévenir l'itinérance pour cette personne-là. Donc, si on la prévient une fois, par exemple, si on prévient un évincement, une éviction, bien, cette personne-là pourrait ne jamais devenir itinérante et on ne la retrouvera pas non plus, par exemple, dans un hôpital, sur le point de quitter l'hôpital sans avoir de logement à elle. Donc, ça veut dire que des interventions de prévention, ça augmente la rentabilité potentielle d'intervention en prévention. Je vais ajouter, James a mentionné les 5 groupes que nous avons déjà. Nous sommes très conscients de notre manquement de 2 groupes en particulier. Un groupe pour les personnes autochtones. Nous n'avons tout simplement pas réussi à trouver une personne du milieu communautaire et une personne du milieu académique, toutes les 2 autochtones, pour co-animer un tel groupe. Si jamais vous avez des suggestions, particulièrement pour le côté académique, nous sommes très ouverts à les entendre. Et aussi la prévention des évictions. C'est un domaine qu'on aurait pu mettre en place, mais ce n'est pas fait encore. Par contre, je vais aussi mentionner qu'il y a quand même une autre activité en parallèle qui se joue grâce à un financement du ministère des Affaires municipales et de l'Habitation au niveau de regarder l'aide à la demande pour les appartements. Donc, nous cherchons à voir comment on peut bonifier le programme d'allocation logement et les PSL pour que ce soit des outils plus efficaces pour augmenter l'abordabilité, l'accessibilité au logement pour les personnes dont les revenus sont plus faibles. Et nous allons parler de ça demain matin d'ailleurs. La prévention de l'itinérance est un domaine dans lequel il n'y a pas eu énormément de recherche encore. On sait par contre que, et ça c'est très clair, que si le logement devient plus abordable, l'itinérance diminue. Et parmi les facteurs qui ont mené à l'accroissement récent de l'itinérance, certainement la hausse des loyers qu'on a observé, surtout ces dernières années, ça s'est clairement intensifié. Si on regarde les données, par exemple, de la SHCL ou SCHL, on voit très clairement cette hausse des loyers dont on parle d'ailleurs beaucoup dans les médias. On sait aussi, grâce notamment au projet Chez Soi, que si on accompagne des personnes en leur offrant un supplément au loyer, on peut faire en sorte que la majorité des personnes qui autrement auraient été itinérantes seront logées et demeureront logées. Et il y a aussi une étude particulièrement intéressante qui montre que la prévention des évictions en mettant à disposition des gens des suppléments au loyer temporaire, payer leur loyer pour quelques mois, ou autre forme d'aide pour résoudre la crise qui menace de les envoyer en itinérance, est économiquement rentable. Non seulement efficace, mais économiquement rentable. Et ce genre de mécanisme existe dans beaucoup de villes américaines. Un autre domaine dans lequel Beth Shin en particulier a fait ressortir des résultats intéressants, c'est l'importance de bien cibler les personnes quand on veut faire de la prévention. Ça ne sert à rien d'offrir un programme qui va coûter de l'argent à l'État à quelqu'un qui a beaucoup d'argent et qui de toute façon ne va pas devenir itinérant. Il peut aussi y avoir des situations où l'argent qui est ciblé sera inefficace. La personne, c'est probablement assez rare dans le contexte de l'itinérance, mais de façon générale, ce n'est pas utile non plus de cibler de l'argent sur des personnes qui ne vont pas bénéficier de l'intervention parce que de toute façon, elles vont, dans ce contexte-ci, devenir en situation d'itinérance. Donc, il faut trouver ce qu'on appelle en anglais le the sweet spot, l'espèce de la zone entre les deux où les efforts qu'on fait vont avoir l'effet maximal sur le nombre de personnes qui, sans l'intervention, seraient devenues itinérantes, grâce à l'intervention, ne le sont pas devenues. Donc, pour pouvoir faire cela, et Beth Shin, encore une fois, a bien démontré ça, il faut collecter des données, il faut analyser les données, parce que l'intuition des intervenants, et ça a été démontré, ne va pas, dans bien des cas, être aussi juste qu'une analyse des données pourrait l'indiquer. Cela dit, comme je l'ai dit juste il y a 3 minutes, la quantité de recherche qui existe actuellement est encore assez embryonnaire. Donc, prenant encore une fois exemple sur les travaux de Esther Duflo et son groupe JPAL, qu'elle mène avec son conjoint, on voit qu'on a le potentiel de faire beaucoup plus de recherches, et particulièrement des recherches expérimentales, pour voir qu'est-ce qui fonctionne, qu'est-ce qui ne fonctionne pas. Et ce que les recherches expérimentales dans le domaine social, comme dans le domaine médical d'ailleurs, nous montrent régulièrement, c'est que des interventions qu'on pensait qui fonctionneraient, en réalité, ne fonctionnent pas bien. Donc étant chercheur, je fais un petit plaidoyer pour la recherche, mais je crois que c'est un plaidoyer qui n'est pas simplement intéressé, mais justifié. Et finalement, je veux terminer en faisant quelques remerciements qui seront sans doute incomplets. Cette journée n'aurait pas lieu sans une subvention du CRSH, donc je remercie le CRSH, et aussi un cofinancement de Old Brewery Mission et de l'Université McGill, particulièrement le département d'équité éthique et politique, et aussi différentes personnes, et en particulier Emily Knox, qui est quelque part ici, et Jennifer Proudfoot, qui ont beaucoup travaillé sur l'organisation de l'événement. Et je veux... Oui. Et je veux aussi remercier le professeur Nandi, qui a parlé au début, pour son aide avec la subvention du CRSH. Donc voilà, sans plus tarder, je vais maintenant passer à introduire notre premier conférencier de la journée, qui est le professeur Peter Mackie. Peter, would you like to come forward, please? Donc, nous sommes très heureux que le professeur Mackie ait été disponible pour nous parler ce matin. Le professeur Mackie est professeur à Cardiff University, dans le pays de Galles, dans le Royaume-Uni. Il est professeur dans l'école de géographie et de planification. Et en fait, le focus central de ses travaux, c'est justement la prévention de l'itinérance. Donc, il est le conférencier parfait pour cette journée. Et son travail a eu beaucoup d'influence, non seulement dans le pays de Galles, mais dans plusieurs autres juridictions, et est d'ailleurs en train de nous influencer au sein du CQPI aussi. Et il est aussi un des éditeurs du International Journal on Homelessness. Alors, c'est une introduction bien courte pour quelqu'un qui a tant d'accomplissements, mais voilà, je vous le présente. Merci.
Good. What have I done wrong, Hannah? Nothing. Okay, good. Yes. Bonjour, bonjour tout le monde, good morning and bodada, Paul. I did warn the translators, that was good morning in Welsh. We're going to ignore you. There'll be a few words I'll drop in, but I don't speak Welsh. I took my headphones off for the introduction to me. I think I understood most of the French. I am the European editor for the International Journal, but our actual managing editor is there, Abe Belchorn, in case I was misattributed to that important role, because Abe does far more work than I do. So, diolch yn fawr, thank you for the opportunity to come speak with you today. They have given an academic an hour to talk. Oh my goodness. So you're about to have an hour-long lecture. No, that's not true. I plan to be done within about 35, 40 minutes. If at any sense I see you nodding off like my master's students, I'm just going to whiz through and we'll get into Q&A, because guaranteed there'll be things in here where you think I'd rather have a conversation than hear him talk anymore. Also, my apologies to translators. I get quite passionate about some of this, and I get fast. Just wave at me if I'm going too fast. So, without further ado, what are we going to talk about? There are two things I'm going to do. One, I'm going to set our terms. I'm going to define prevention. Yeah, we're using this term. It is a term that is in the name of the Collectif. Let's talk about it. Let's define prevention like any good academic essay. And in defining that, I'm then going to map out a little bit about what we know around what works to prevent homelessness. I posed the question, kind of provocatively at the start, about we know what works, why don't we do it? And I'm going to spend one slide with 4 really important bullet points about why I think we don't do it. That's really important. Then we're going to move on to the second half of the presentation, where we're going to narrow in, zoom in on a particular approach, the duty to assist, which is a Canadian term attributed to a piece of Welsh legislation. Nobody in Wales uses duty to assist. It doesn't exist. It's called the Housing Wales Act, but Steve Gates from Canada labelled it duty to assist, so everyone in Canada refers to it as that. And I'll just drill down and talk a little bit about that innovative bit of legislation that is driving prevention upstream. There are a few caveats. One is I'm going to talk about what works, and kind of as Eric said, we don't have great evidence on prevention, but I'll talk about what we do know. It's based, the first part is on a selected review of literature that was done fairly fast for the EU. There are much more robust systematic reviews out there. And look, I'm talking mostly about the global north. I think some of the most exciting opportunities come through collaboration that go north-south and beyond, and we're not yet having those conversations. The Journal is trying to encourage some of those conversations. One of our biggest challenges, migration and homelessness. That's the primary driver of homelessness in the global south, and we're not in conversation. So that's a caveat, is this is very much global north. Right, get on with it, Pete. So what works and why we don't do it? First, I'm going to introduce you to the typology, our definition essentially. So one, and it's a temporal-based, a time-based typology of prevention. We have universal prevention. That is basically population-wide stuff that we can do that will have a significant impact on the prevention of homelessness. There are 2 key population-wide interventions. One is ensuring that folk have enough money in their pocket, poverty reduction. We've tested this empirically. It's the primary driver of homelessness, certainly in the UK context, and I expect more broadly, and in the Australian context. Poverty. Yeah. So if we whatever our wider measures are, if we can address poverty, we have a big impact on reducing homelessness. The other one is housing markets. People need suitable, affordable homes in places where they want to live. Everyone always forgets that last little caveat to the sentence. We've got enough homes. They're adaptable for life when we go through disability, etc. But they're not in places where anybody wants to live. They're in high-rise estates where folk are going to reject and move elsewhere. So Suitable, affordable homes where people want to live. If we have those structural factors in place, we go a long way towards preventing homelessness. So we call it the keystone, the foundation of homelessness prevention. I'm not going to talk any more about those. They're important. We should be lobbying for those, but I'm then going to move down temporally into the other parts of the typology. So then we have upstream prevention. What we're talking about here is prevention at points of risky transition or groups we know are at higher risk of homelessness. And we know that evidence base. We've been really good as academics, as practitioners, and folk with lived experience of telling us the points at which and the people most likely to end up homeless. We know who's at risk. So they are, as Eric said, transitions from institutions like prison, criminal justice, like prison, like care, through health systems in some countries. Yeah? So these risky transitions and population groups who we know are at more risk. That's where we want to be. We want to be upstream. Then we get closer and closer to crisis point. We have crisis prevention. Crisis prevention is where homelessness is foreseeable. Yeah? We know homelessness is foreseeable. In the UK context, we define this as 56 days. It's foreseeable because somebody has been given their eviction notice. You are going to be out of your accommodation in 56 days. That's how long you've got to get out of your private rented apartment. So we've got this 56 or 2 month. We're very good with very precise numbers of days because so much is tied to the law in the UK. But you've got 2 months to prevent homelessness. That actually gives you a window where you can find options and solutions. Crisis prevention. That's where the legislation that I'm going to talk to you about in a bit lies. Right, then we get, from crisis prevention, we get to emergency prevention. Emergency prevention is if we don't do something today, tomorrow, you are going to be homeless. That's pretty much where most of the prevention activity lies, right at point of emergency. Why is that problematic? Because you haven't got many options, have you? If somebody is going to be homeless tomorrow, then my ability to negotiate with the landlord, to pay off some debts, etc., they're gone. That person is leaving. So that's emergency prevention. And then we have the last one, which is kind of the outlier in the typology, but needs to be there, is repeat prevention. And that is somebody has already been homeless, and we're trying to stop it happening again. The sustained exits work that again, Eric was talking about. So that's our typology. Hands up who thinks that we're doing lots and lots of work at upstream prevention. It's going to be like a lecture, I told you. Hands up who thinks we're doing lots and lots of work at crisis prevention. Oh, come on, Canada, Montreal, you're supposed to be like the best part in Canada, most progressive. I said that in Toronto when I presented there too. No, I'm only kidding. Okay, what about emergency prevention? Is that where we spend most of our time and our money? Repeat prevention. Are you guys not spending any time or money? Some of you didn't put your hand up at all. The reality is most of our money is going on emergency and repeat. It's the shelters. Where we do start to look at prevention, at best we're getting to crisis. It's ridiculous, isn't it? We know where we need to be. We'll come on to why we're perhaps not doing that in a bit. So what I'm going to do is just reflect on each of those stages and try and just draw out a little bit about what we know to just put some ideas in people's heads to go away with, to discuss. Upstream prevention through these institutional settings, particularly the criminal justice system. We have a systematic review that basically told us the evidence is limited, it does lead to kind of sustained housing outcomes in many cases, but the types of intervention vary massively in terms of the point at which we start trying to intervene and how long the support lasts. Do we intervene in the prison, and how long will we stick around to ensure that that tendency is sustained afterwards? Loads of variation, generally some fairly positive outcomes. The most researched intervention is one called a critical time intervention, which many of you will have heard of. That's got a really clearly defined approach. A period in the prison setting, and then 9 months afterwards, and then support stops. and that support transitions out in 3-month periods, gradually phasing into community supports and away from the support team. Now we're trying to do and evaluate a critical time intervention in prisons in England and Wales at the moment. And we thought, we're bringing extra support staff into the prison for this pre-period. Our biggest obstacle is prison services are just like homelessness services. They are stretched beyond imagination. So what do you think they're doing? Even having an extra member of staff in, they're so busy dealing with point of crisis, with people exiting prison, they haven't got time to support others to engage 3-4 months before discharge. That then leads us to another obstacle, doesn't it? Actually, we're not just fixing our own systems and our supports, and we can't just pop an intervention in. We're having to fundamentally fix these other systems, the criminal justice system, where they're just under-resourced, understaffed. There are places where you'll hear any conference on homelessness or prevention, Finland gets mentioned, because they are just cracking it. They're doing really well, and their principle is, at the point in which we come into contact with you, that's where we're going to secure your housing. And they're doing that very well. Okay, next, upstream prevention, staying there, and we're talking about aging out of care. So again, I'm drawing on somebody else's work here, a meta-analysis based largely or entirely on US studies. We're really bad at evaluating outside of the US and North America more generally, in robust ways. It's still, in some of those studies, even with supports, is normal to become homeless when aging out of care, even with these intervention supports. That probably doesn't surprise many folk here. So what's working? There's promise around Housing First for Youth, which has at its fundamental principles, choice, settled accommodation, and others, but choice and settled accommodation. There are some positive pilots. Scotland is doing some great work here around Housing First for Youth, but again, Finland leading the way where it's mainstreamed, it's default. One point I like to raise here, and again it's kind of highlighting the problem. We had this wonderful poet called Lem Cisse in the UK who's been through the care system. I don't know that it's true here in Canada, but we often talk about people who are care leavers. Does that translate? To use the word care leavers? We use it a lot in the UK to describe folk who've been in the care system. And this poet said to us, and he gave a presentation to a youth homeless conference, he said, we've got to stop using this term. Young people don't leave care. Care leaves them. And again, I think that comes down to the absolute fundamental of what's happening here. Folk are in care, and care is leaving them. It's those points of transitions. It has to stick. In Wales at the moment, we're piloting a universal basic income, so trying to address the financial aspect for anybody who's been in care. Right, moving on, because I'm probably taking too long. Right, then we're staying at upstream. I wanted to focus on upstream because that's where I want us to get to. There's an increasing use of screening tools. And we're being co-sponsored by a team that focus on ethics, so there's going to be a whole load of interesting discussion here. But screening tools that help us to identify folk who are at risk of homelessness, and then we have an intervention. I've just picked out 3. Each time I give this talk, I mix up the kind of 3 that I use. Maidstone Borough Council, I only found out about fairly recently in England, has something called the One View data analytics approach, and it basically combines all the data they've got on debt, on people going to arrears in their local authority area. It automatically sends a note to the housing options team, and that person gets in contact and says, look, how is everything? Our system has flagged you. Do you need any supports? And it led to a 40% reduction in homelessness, at least because the evaluation was, it wasn't a randomized control trial or anything, and it's likely to be even greater than that. The next one is the one that most excites me. Eric said there's no silver bullets. This is the closest to a silver bullet I think we've got around youth homelessness. The Geelong project that comes from Australia and is now being adapted in Canada, in America, and in Wales. Basically, the principle of it is a screening tool in secondary schools, in high school, And that tool asks young people about their lives. It's their chance to say, this is what's going on at home, with some very, very basic questions that identify levels of risk of homelessness in a couple of ways. So one is, there's a question in there that says, did you sleep last week, last month, away from home because you couldn't stay at home? Really low-level stuff. You would not be on social services radar, but it's enough to say there's something going on at home that says you can't be there just for a night or two. And it asks about levels of conflict at home. We know the primary driver, the primary trigger of youth homelessness is conflict at home. The driver is a whole heap of other things. A young person coming out, conflict. A step-parent, conflict. But the trigger is conflict. And so we're able to identify that and then intervene. And the intervention is normally some sort of family mediation. It's not the fear here. I can see my ethics department colleagues are like, you do what? You do a survey of kids and then you intervene? And we can talk about it. It's not that the survey doctrinally determines that you're going to get an intervention. The coordinator in Wales, who I love, Tal, he articulates it like this. He says, the survey is the whisper before the conversation. The whisper before the conversation. The survey just says something's happening, and then you have a conversation. It might be that they just ticked all the boxes because they didn't want to do the survey. That's fine. The conversation will tell you that. So that's how it's used. Don't pick on me, ethics. Right, so that's upstream. Then we have another example from the US, which I don't know so much about, but the homelessness screening clinical reminder is basically 2 questions when veterans are going for health checkups that ask about housing. Are you homeless now? Are you likely to be homeless in the next months? And that, whilst it's not been evaluated, seems to coalesce with a reduction in veteran homelessness. Again, we're very bad at evaluating these things. But again, that's upstream prevention through screening tools. We then get into point of crisis, so this kind of foreseeable period where homelessness is foreseeable. And the primary area of activity is around evictions prevention, globally. This is where most of the work is happening. And just a way of framing it, we have legal requirements. Legal requirements. So, I forget which way around it is, in Austria, they're basically required by law to notify if there's going to be an eviction to the equivalent of social services team, somebody that might intervene. The law just says you've got to notify them. Brilliant, stage 1 complete, but that's it. So they've just got a piece of paper that says, great, somebody's going to be homeless, nobody is then required to do anything. So the next iteration of that is the Belgian example, where beyond the requirement to notify, there's then a requirement to act. You've got to do something about it. Evictions is one of our primary routes into homelessness. So again, this holds a huge amount of promise. Again, really bad at evaluating its effectiveness. But that's where I think there's a huge amount of promise. We've then got short-term financial assistance. This is commonplace, really commonplace. This is the bread and butter of what we do in Wales. There are some evaluations, but essentially enough to tide somebody over, to pay off a small amount of their rent arrears. Because your landlords say, if you've got rent arrears, you can't come in and have this property. If you don't have a bond, a month's deposit, you can't have this property. We can use this short-term financial assistance to cover that. I know in Canada, Hannah, there's some stuff around this with what did you call them? Bond banks? Rent banks, slightly different, but we're going to learn more about that, I think, in the rest of the conference. That would sit here. And then you've got legal advice and support, where there is some US evidence that tells us where you've got that legal advocacy, we're more likely to see prevention of homelessness. So that's a whole load of ideas just on the table for you about things that are happening around crisis prevention. There are other forms of crisis prevention. And what we're looking at is routes into homelessness, triggers, drivers. Relationship breakdown is another primary driver of homelessness or trigger of homelessness. What's going on in that space? For young people, it's primarily about mediation, family mediation. That's our primary intervention. We haven't evaluated that well at all. And the fears there, my fears, and I've seen it with organisations that I've worked with, is your main outcome you're measuring is the number of young people enabled to return home. You know, success is if we get 80% of young people to return home. Be careful. Sometimes the most suitable, sustainable route is a planned move out. You know, we're not about moving people back home if that's not safe. But mediation, that addressing the relationship, is a key intervention. The other is where predominantly women are facing domestic abuse and are fleeing that domestic abuse. Now, our response there is varied, and there is an increasing shift towards what's being called in the UK target hardening. So you're trying to create spaces where the woman predominantly can stay, the perpetrator has to leave, and then you're making that as safe a space as you can. Reinforced windows, alarms, etc. I have a PhD student, a wonderful PhD student working with me she's just passed actually, Rebecca Jackson, whose whole PhD was on this and actually really problematizes some of these responses. Because you can remain at home, and she came up with the term complicit communities. You can remain at home, but the whole community could be involved in the perpetration of this violence, reporting on you, telling the perpetrator, etc. So we just have to be so nuanced and individualize our responses, is my word of warning there. But again, there's not much research in that space. So, I think I'm doing all right for time, about 25, right? Yeah. Okay, you don't know how many more slides are to come. Right, anyway. So, we know what works, why don't we do it? 4 points I've put up. Effective universal prevention, or its absence. And I take the words of Isabel Baptista, who does an awful lot around prevention too, and is brilliant. Internationally, no level of coordination, evidence-led practice, or comprehensiveness of response has been found that counteracts the effects of insufficient, affordable, adequate homes in places where people want to live. Yeah? We can do all of these things I've just described around upstream and crisis prevention, but if we're not building enough homes and ensuring that folk have enough income, it totally undermines everything else. Yeah? So we have to have our eyes on that. We can't just get obsessed with the things that we can control as a sector, because that's the problem, is we do the thing, well, what powers have we got? We have to also be the voice, because we're seeing the outcome of the failings of these other policies. So that's the first one. Or political will and resources. There's Leilani Farha, Canadian, articulated this the best. She says, if we want change, if we want to prevent homelessness, we need governments to turn up. We're asking for a shift of system. We're putting, as I asked you, I've got you to put all your hands up, all our money into emergency prevention, repeat prevention. We're asking for a shift. We want to close shelters. We don't want them to exist. We want to put that money upstream. Now, of course, to start with, you need the shelters whilst you shift upstream, and it's going to take a long time. It's probably going to take more than your period of elected office to get prevention working, so it needs long-term commitments. It needs political will, cross-party political will. Systematic integration. So often what you find are these wonderful pockets of great activity, but they're piecemeal. They're scattered. We've not got systematic change, and so we can't get the degree of impact that we're after. So that's the third one. And I'll talk about the Welsh context where we've perhaps got that right. And then collaboration and buy-in between public bodies. The more we want to move upstream, the less we're going to be talking with each other as a homelessness sector. You're going to be in conversations with prison services, with health services, yeah, with these other sectors that are the ones that are driving folk into homelessness. So increasingly we need their buy-in and their engagement. How do we make that work? I don't have the answers, I'm just giving you the problems. Sorry if I was called here to give the answers, Eric. Right, that's it for the big broad brush picture. We're now going to move on to a little bit of a focus on duty to assist. How long have I got, Hannah? I'd say at least 15 minutes. 17 minutes to do this bit? Yeah, great. Okay, we're in good time. Okay, here we go. I have timed this kind of. Sometimes the stories take me in tangents and I then lose time. Right, so as I say, it's the Housing Wales Act. So if you want to go and find it, because I often get Canadians going, Pete, have you not written anything on duty to assist? I was like, it's called the Housing Wales Act. It really is. Or reasonable steps, but the Housing Wales Act, if you want to find anything on it. Duty to assist, as coined by the awesome Steve Gates. So why did we introduce a new prevention-focused approach? A lot of this is going to be very familiar to you. So we had high levels of homelessness, continuing, time for change. This is just a graph of the levels of applications. Yes, we have a legal system that requires an application for assistance. These were our homelessness applications. They were just rising, exactly as Eric said. They are rising. They were rising up until 2014 when we were looking to review the legislation. Things had to change. Not only were they not stagnant, they were getting worse. Secondly, we had, before our Housing Wales Act, this really unequal all or nothing priority need test legislation. In short, if you were homeless in Wales, England or Wales, and you went to the local authority, they were under a duty to provide you temporary accommodation until they could find you settled accommodation. And you could legally challenge that on an individual basis. That's world-leading legislation. I had to get you settled accommodation, council housing, social housing, predominantly. That sounds amazing, doesn't it? And if I don't, you can legally challenge me on an individual basis. We're not talking right to housing unenforceable. It was legally enforceable. But because of the recognition of we only have so many resources, we said that is only true if you're in priority need. You're in a priority group. Who would we put in those priority groups? I'm going to wake you up just for a second. Who would you put in priority? Don't spend long, get hands up quickly because I've only got 15 more minutes. Who would you put in your priority group? This is youth. Youth. Elderly. People with children. Two more. Disability. Humans. Oh, that's everybody. Okay, so they're prioritizing. Agreed, that's where we get to. That's the conclusion. But we didn't. So under the old law, it was basically if you had children, you were in priority, or if you'd been through the care system up to the age of 21. After 21, you weren't any more in priority. And if you had children. All those other groups really didn't make it in. Single homeless on the streets did not make it in. So it was an all or nothing system, entirely problematic. We did have, emerging at the time, around 2014, we had these prevention services emerging, but they were really underdeveloped, underthought through. They weren't uniformly available. Some areas did it, some didn't. And they were really selectively delivered. The worst thing was, guess who we were doing the prevention work for? All the folk that we were otherwise going to have to house, we were trying to prevent homelessness with. The folk that we owed no duty to, the single people, we really weren't doing much prevention work with. So they were losing out in both the legislation and the practice. So something needed to change. They were the challenges we were trying to fix. So the Welsh Duty to Assist, or the Housing Wales Act 2014, here's what it is. It's law, it's really complicated, but I'm going to try and just give you the bare bones of it. I don't even understand the full detail of it, and I helped write it. So, it attempts to prioritise homeless prevention, reorienting services, entitlements, and crucially, funding. If government says you've got to do this, now there has to be money. It makes access to prevention services a universal right. And here's the interesting bit, Eric, because I caught in the translation you were talking about who the folk that we might try and prevent with, but actually they would resolve their own homelessness. This takes a completely different approach. It's universal. If you come in and seek help, then you will get it. It's universal. We're not trying to do any screening of who might solve their own homelessness. Forget spending any time on that. We'll just do whatever's required. We'll come on to what it looks like in a second, but we'll take steps to try and prevent your homelessness, irrespective of if you might solve it yourself. Yeah, so we've fixed the whole prioritization bit. Everybody will get this. What does it look like? Well, when we did the research to inform this, everyone's like, we need a duty to prevent homelessness. That doesn't work. When you try and get that through the lawyers, or even actually when you just try and think, they're going to fail. You're going to fail that duty with some people for various reasons. So the lawyers wouldn't let that in. So we came up with something, or a phrasing, that was to take reasonable steps. So the duty on local authorities is to take reasonable steps to help to prevent or relieve homelessness. That means the local authority, if you come in, has to help you. They've got to take these reasonable steps to try and prevent you losing your home or find you an alternative. Not only that, they've got to have recourse to a wide range of options in their tool bag, essentially. It's supposed to be individualized. The statute guidance says, look at each individual. So our conversation earlier about people facing domestic abuse, I should be individualizing my response to your needs. Prevention was defined as successful if your accommodation was likely to last for 6 months. That sounds very low, doesn't it? It's only 6 months because that's how much you get in a private rented flat. It's a really insecure tenancy in the UK. And then here's the last one that was, I'll come on to tell you why it was problematic, but we had people who were also expected to cooperate. I did not put that in the plan. The local authorities got that in. And here's the interesting, it got through because language is so important, isn't it? We said, we're talking about rights. These are rights. And there are some words that just go hand in glove, together. What goes with rights? Who said it? Responsibilities. So everyone's like, oh, of course, yeah. Rights, responsibilities. Otherwise they're going to abuse our great system. We are literally about to get rid of this bit of the legislation. So I'll come on and problematize it in a sec. These are some of the things, the interventions that local authorities ought to have. Predominantly, we're talking about trying to prevent evictions from private rented accommodation. With young people, it's mediation. But there's quite a list of different things that local authorities ought to be doing. I'll share these slides so you can grab them. I'm going to just jump on. So what's worked well? Look, we keep data on all of this. It's not great. It's not been evaluated well, I don't think, which is a conversation for perhaps later on. But we're preventing homelessness for about 67% of people that come in and say, I'm at risk of losing my property. What we don't have is a control group. We don't know what would have happened if we hadn't acted. So, take this with a pinch of salt. But it's consistent. Single people and families, remember we had this all or nothing. Single people literally got nothing before. Outcomes are now pretty similar. I mean, this is one of the major successes of the legislation. Yeah. And then what else do I want to say? We did some very early qualitative work, and I always use this quote because I think it illustrates, and it's important to remember what we had before. So this fella said, look, this time round it's been totally different. Before I would have had to take my sleeping bag, my flask, because you'd be there for the duration of the day. The staff would have faces down to their arses, in and out of rooms moaning, This time, totally different. They speak to you on a personal level, a better basis. Suddenly we've shifted. These folk are eligible for support, treat them differently. Now, there are loads of problems with implementation that haven't necessarily worked well. This kind of innovative, individualized set of steps that local authorities were going to take, inevitably when you've got a law and duties, people look to routinize these efforts, and that's what's happening. They're not individualizing the responses. There's a bit of extra bureaucracy that we need to deal with. Failure to cooperate was being used way too much in different ways. And even if they don't put it into the data and say we discharged our duty because they failed to cooperate, they hold the failure to cooperate, banner above these folks. So you better do this because otherwise you're out. We can discharge our duty. There are some local connection tests being applied. And really the systemic learning was we have a far greater success rate if folk come into the system earlier. So if somebody gets an eviction notice and then they turn up and ask for help, or even earlier, we've got way more options. So socializing the legislation, making sure folk are aware of their rights, but also how can we get folk to come in earlier? Now the idea that wider public services should be doing way more. this duty was on the local authority housing department. Really, our lesson was we should have put duties on these other public bodies to do more. So that's what England did. When they copied our law, they put this duty on public bodies to refer, but it's only a refer. We're now reviewing the legislation. We've got a review group that's been running for about 6 months. All this is going to shift further upstream. The duties are going to be on other public bodies. We haven't quite figured out what they look like, but probably some sort of ask and act duty. So that's where we're at. 5 key lessons, and then we're literally there. Look, the duty to assist has been, in broad terms, a really effective tool. If you speak to local authorities, they would tell you we'd never go back to the old system. It has moved things upstream, but we're still at point of crisis. We need to get others, public bodies involved more significantly. What else did I want to say? Yeah, the rights and responsibilities one just needs thinking through. Be brave, is what I'd say. The assumption that folk are going to game your system, you can't escape it. Be brave. And don't lean towards that as your assumption or your starting point. And the last one is the key lesson from Wales. Legislation alone isn't good enough. We're a really gentle country, I think, Wales. We're great at developing ideas and legislation, but we seem to be terrified of monitoring and holding folk to account. So implementation is where we've really struggled, I think, in really holding to account those authorities that aren't doing what they should. Even if they're abiding by the letter of the law, they're not abiding by the intent of the law. So implementation. And I think in Canada, you've got the advocate, the housing rights advocate, etc. There's more, I think, attention towards that. So diolch yn fawr, that's it. Hopefully that leaves enough time. And merci for Q&A. So I think we've left 20 minutes. You better have some questions, otherwise I'm going back to one of the slides. I think it's the routine to come up to the mics. I love it. Oh, brilliant.
I can get it all. Okay. All right.
Hi, Pete. Nice to see you. I'm interested about money, and so I'm curious to hear, with this legislation in place, did it drive more funds into the system? If not, why not? Because presumably it would. If it did drive more funding into the system, where was that coming from? Was that the councils had to start increasing their funding, or was it other orders of government? I'm interested about the money side of the legislation.
Good question. So, yes, it drove more money. Here's the really interesting bit. When they commissioned me, Welsh Government commissioned me to do the research that led to the legislation, I just remember sitting down on a table like this and the head of the Homelessness Division saying, Pete, you know there's no more money, so whatever you come up with has to be able to implement it. This was like 2012. We were just coming through the global financial crisis. It was austerity. Sorry, I'm getting excited. So that was the caveat to the legislation. In the development of the law, the sector really got behind it. It was so participatory. We just had rooms full of people just coming up with ideas exactly like the kind of constituents in this room. So there was a real momentum. There was no way Welsh Government could then change that law and not put money in. So they'd intended to fund and then taper off, because the intention was, well, we'll do all this great prevention work, our temporary accommodation costs will come down. And that did start to happen. We had folk closing temporary accommodation in the first 2 years, but then other wider structural factors came into play. Homeless applications, full stop, were getting higher, and essentially they've maintained and actually increased that budget. It hasn't ever tapered down. So that comes from Welsh Government, our equivalent of, I guess, probably equivalent of the province, funding down to municipalities here. So it was from our national government through to our local authorities, and then that's continued. And that money goes into a pot for local authorities with great autonomy on how they spend that. But it increased the funding for prevention activities. Yeah. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Peter, thanks for a great presentation, and I really appreciate all the work you've done on this in general. As you know, a lot of writers have borrowed from the public health research and have this three-part typology for prevention, so primary, secondary, or tertiary. It's quite simple. I love it for its simplicity. In fact, Jim Hughes can seamlessly integrate the language into a conversation like it's nothing. It's great. But I know you and Suzanne and Steve Gates and others have worked on advancing that, and you've got a 5-level typology. I find the newly developed ones, including your own, if I may say, they just complicate things, and I get confused every time I look at them. What is wrong with the simple 3-part typology? Why can't we keep to that simple typology? Can you convince me why we have to go beyond that?
Yeah, that's a good one. Oh, Nick, I knew you were going to... As soon as I saw you rolling up to the microphone, I thought, somebody sit him down. Right, brilliant question. We kind of address this in the paper, and you also remind me, look, the typology, we've essentially advanced it in the paper we wrote. We say we're advancing it, because this was developed by local authorities. It was their creation. There were a couple of extra bits to it. It was a little bit more complicated. Some of the terms were different, but it was theirs. So collectively, they felt this was a tool that worked better for them than the public health. Suzanne and I have then adapted it. Second point to make, Suzanne Fitzpatrick, awesome scholar, is the co-author on the paper where we first introduced the typology. What does it do? The first thing with the public health one is if I say to you what's secondary prevention, I'll get 100 different answers in here. And in every paper, there's 100 different definitions of secondary. Is it before homelessness? Is it when somebody's already been homeless, but we want the exit to be really swift? It seems simple, but it's actually a little on the confusing side. Primary prevention then gets disaggregated often into kind of population groups, population-wide. So, as I say, it sounds simple. When you start trying to use it in any sort of way as an heuristic tool to understand what you're doing and where you might focus efforts, it becomes almost useless, the primary, secondary, tertiary. We'd have loved to have just taken primary, secondary, tertiary, because we were just looking at a way of framing a piece of work, program of work, where we were trying to map out what was happening around prevention. And it meant we just ended up bunging huge amounts into secondary, and then when you're reading the literature, you're like, actually, no, this isn't secondary. So that was why we arrived at it. And we dwelt a long time over the framing of it, and our conclusion is, look, it's all about timing. That's what ours does. It's all about timing. When do we intervene? But, oh goodness, it's a tool. It's a heuristic tool. Don't use it dogmatically. Use it as a starting point, and then things will get messy, won't they? Yeah, it's a good question, though.
Hi, Peter.
Hey, Eric.
That was really great. Thank you very much. Really a wonderful overview and delivered with style and in a very interesting way. Thank you. I have 2 questions that are kind of fairly brief to formulate, but may take a little while to answer. The first one is kind of what was the impetus for the work that you briefly described, where kind of a lot of people in the community, you said a group similar to ours, got together and started formulating the kind of legislation that this could be, like there had to be some sort of spark. Yeah. This hasn't, I'm sure you played a role in that, being in that sparking process, but can you say a bit more about that with a view to like what would we need to do to get to the same place? And the second question is, you alluded to at the end of your talk to the fact that kind of for all the successes of the legislation to date, there are some limitations in what's come out of it, especially on the implementation front. If you had to redraft the legislation, or if you could amend the legislation at this point, are there changes that you would make so that you would better address those concerns? So those are my 2 questions. Thanks.
Brilliant. They're nice questions. So the first one, what was the impetus? I kind of talked to it. We had a system that was this all or nothing. And there was, imagine you guys as a sector. Where's Cecile? Cecile, you're in Dontarou, and you are constantly seeing folk rocking up at the door because they fall outside of this legislation. What's Cecile going to do? Cecile is going to be knocking on provincial government's door every day of the week. There'll be 100 research reports coming from Dans la Rue documenting how unfair this system is and how problematic it is. And that's what the sector, academics, third sector organisations, even local authority networks saying, this isn't working, we've got a lot of people falling out the system. So it was a known problem. Welsh Government committed to look at the legislation. So it's a known problem, we'll look at it with no commitments to what that might look like. It could have simply been, Dans la Rue is the most vocal, to keep Cecile quiet, we'll include young people as a priority need group. And then everyone else is fairly quiet, whatever. It could have ended up there. It didn't. We reviewed the legislation. I got commissioned to review the legislation, and my approach was, I'm going to fill the room with folk like this, and each table is going to talk about the problems and the potential solutions, and out will come a set of ideas, and that's what we did. And of course then you had buy-in, because you know, here's the ideas, they're yours. We've just come up with a way of drafting it into law. So that was the impetus. We had a system that was wrong. Interestingly, you know, often when you get change, it's, you know, financial drivers or whatever, but it was a real sense of there's a social injustice, and we can without a doubt, I can put hand on heart and say that there was a sense from Welsh Government that there was a social injustice here. Something was going wrong, and we're a nation that wants to do better. That's not always true in, I don't think that was the driver in England. When they copied it, I think they looked over and went, oh, they've moved ahead. Look at the reduction in people in temporary accommodation. This could save us. So I don't think it had the same impetus. So that's the question on the impetus. You need the you know, the folk that are going to change the law need to be around the table and committed to it. They need to be there. The second one was legislative changes. I'd changed loads. And we, as I say, we are reviewing it now. So COVID did something look, I missed loads of bits on the law because it's complicated. If we fail to prevent, because it's not, you haven't got to have prevented homelessness. If you fail at this reasonable steps, then you revert to the old system at the moment, priority need. So I've tried with all of you. You all came and asked for help. I've tried with all of you under the law. I failed for this group. You guys I failed for, but because you've got children or were in the care system, I've still got to house you. Yeah, I still owe you a final duty. You guys, I'm sorry I tried. I had fundamental issues with this, but it's what we could get through at the time. It was an iterative development of the law. Now, COVID hit. You guys, we've got to get you in because you're a public health issue to me. Yeah? Yeah? Government had just before COVID commissioned some other work, which we'd done, that said we've got to get rid of this priority need test for the remaining folk that we keep leaving out after trying. They were warm to it, had committed, yep, we're going to get rid of the test. COVID came, we got rid of the test, and we've not gone back. So now we are reviewing what will the legislation look like. You guys are in, everybody is in terms of the backstop, and we're putting duties on new public bodies. They're the big ones. We need other bodies. We need the prisons, we need health, we need care, taking their responsibility. So we're going to put duties there. And then the other one, as I said before, just don't worry about failure to cooperate. Just leave the duty on the authorities to take steps. Once you've taken your steps, you can discharge your duty. Don't worry about failure to cooperate. This whole idea of people gaming the system, get rid of that. And then on implementation, and I asked for it, we just didn't get it, was a regulator. And regulators can play they can play a supportive role. Look, this is happening, it's not good enough, here's what other authorities are doing that you could learn from. A regulator that both holds to account and draws together that knowledge and that practice, that we are desperate for. Absolutely desperate for, that we don't have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Hi. Hi, Pete. Thank you.
Jane.
Actually, what you were just talking about, can you speak more about, in these phases while you're trying to move more upstream, what conversations look like with like care and schools and other institutions that might not be thinking they're responsible, and how that's going?
Yeah, okay. So we're mixed. Criminal justice, so again, I don't know quite the kind of constitutional makeup in Canada, but certain things are devolved to Wales. That's one of the reasons we got primary lawmaking powers in 2011, and homelessness was one of the first things we sought to address. Domestic abuse was the other. So we have housing. We do not have welfare. We do not have immigration. And we don't have criminal justice. So those things, if we want to amend them, they have to happen in Westminster in England. I don't know if there's some of that at kind of federal down to provincial level here. So criminal justice is our biggest challenge. It's really hard to get anywhere with them. And even if you get there at the top level, what you find is to change anything in practice then requires everyone through that system to be on board with it. And homelessness prevention just is not seen as their priority, understandably. So that's the group where even we've got them at national level on board, but at operational, I think we're going to really, really struggle, and that'll be a long, long journey. Where we seem to be doing well, not on the legislative element, so this is kind of the reverse. We haven't got the legislation on schools yet. We're still looking at what that will look like. But the practice we've already started to do. So we've started the Upstream project, which is the survey that goes into schools. That's a mechanism through which we identify young people at risk. We haven't been to a school that has said anything other than yes, please. Because normally they're getting this extra resource, and unlike the prisons that can't accommodate it, schools are so used to having well-being officers and supports there. In our I know it's totally different in Canada, US, etc. Schools have literally, yes, please. Partly because we were coming in around COVID, and the survey also asked about well-being, and they're like, we need to know how the young people are doing. So schools have been really warm. Nationally, in terms of legislation and putting duties on them to do this, we've not got there yet. Yeah. So a bit of a mixed picture. 5.
Hi there. I have a sort of logistical question because I've been working on the immigration group, and there are actually services to help newcomers look for housing and find their housing when they first arrive. But the problem we have, I think there's lots of places, there's just no housing available, or the stuff that's on the market is like way beyond the means of the average person. So I'm just wondering, if the obligation is to find housing for people, is there another piece of this that links to housing construction, like social housing development? Because I feel like this would be a big barrier for us here.
No, that is a super, super question. And it's kind of what I was alluding to with the primary prevention stuff. So technically, no, there isn't a link, and it is the challenge that the greatest challenge that local authorities have. We simply don't have enough housing that people can afford. And one of the problems we face, so I'm going to give problems, not many solutions here. One of the problems we face is welfare, social welfare is not devolved. So our income support, our housing benefit, our housing vouchers equivalent, whatever, that's not devolved, that's determined at Westminster. And what Westminster did is it said, we'll set our local housing allowance at 1/3 of market rents, so people can afford 1/3 of properties in the area. And they did that, and then through austerity they said, we're going to freeze it. It won't go up. And of course the housing market went up, and so then the number of properties in some areas that you could afford went to 0. Because local housing allowance, we just have no control despite lobbying and asking for that to change. It changed in COVID. It got uprated back up to 1/3 because it affected the middle classes who were on furlough. This is what we deal with in Westminster. So again, a whole load of the market became available, but then they've frozen it again since COVID, and we're seeing the same pattern emerge. So access to housing, that's assuming that there is enough housing, that you can actually afford what's there. Then in terms of, do we have enough homes in the right places where people want to live? No, we absolutely don't. We don't, and it's the biggest challenge. But what the duty says, the housing element of the duty is, if somebody is homeless, then you've got to provide them temporary accommodation until you can find settled accommodation. And that's got to meet a certain suitability standard, the temporary accommodation. So nobody should have to be on the streets, but that varies massively in terms of its quality. Generally with families we get it right, but with single people the quality of that temporary accommodation I don't think is up to scratch very often. there's two things to say. One is, in this legislation review group, it's one of the biggest challenges we're trying to work on, so to align the house building programs with the assessment of need. They have to do that, but really to make sure that they're programming in predictions around numbers for who they would owe duties under homelessness to. But here's the other point, and the one that I kept making to government, is because they were scared of getting rid of priority need until there was enough housing. My argument is you had this piece of law that tried to prevent homelessness with you. I had a paid professional whose sole job in life it was to find housing or keep you housing. It's all I do in life when I'm in 9 to 5. And I failed to find you housing. And now I'm going to send you out into the market with nothing. How are they going to fare? It's much better that the duty is on me than the expectation is on them. Because if the duty is on me, guess what? I will feed into the folk who actually build houses because they're not going to have the power to do that. So that was my argument, is I'd rather the duty was here on the authority because they will then have to, they've got roots into the construction of housing that the public don't have. So yeah, that's where we're at. It's one of our trickiest issues is actually have we got housing. Of course there are lots of innovative solutions you can do, so some of the stuff around chosen families, it doesn't have to, it can be actually you're living with somebody else. The stuff that's happening in the US at the moment? Yeah, good question. I think we're done. We've got less than 1 minute, so we've got...
Okay, I'll go really quickly. So thank you for the presentation. This is more like I guess a practical question. You talk about the institutionalization, and then we're talking about the implementation. More and more at the federal level, at the Government of Canada, we try to have more engagement and collaboration for people with lived experience of homelessness, right? The problem that we have sometimes is we do focus on the academic, then we focus on a specific population, but then we never have necessarily all those people at the table towards the same objective, because we're not talking the same language. So what would be your tips to make sure that we're making those engagement and collaboration processes meaningful and effective? Because even though we do have, let's say, the institutionalized piece, when it's time to draft those things and implement them, how do you gather those people around the table while you don't have necessarily the same objectives?
Fixing collaboration, I probably can't do in a minute. So what I'll do is, I'm going to park it, because I think everyone needs coffee too. So I'll park that one for a bit, and we'll catch it over coffee. Does that sound? Is that all right? Perfect. I can't fix collaboration in a minute.
Well, I'm just going to say, maybe this is a start, right? We're here today. We're here. So, on va avoir une pause. On a 20 minutes. Prenez un café, tirez-vous, on revient, on continue la discussion.